One of the things I want to point out is that growth, I mean, it can be portrayed as, as a product of the pursuit of trivial items. But let's look at it historically. Growth has saved us, has saved the people on the planet for a few hundred years. I mean, I'm thinking, back to the 18th century when population growth started to increase after centuries and centuries of virtually no growth. When Thomas Malthus, first worries about the constraints of the planet and says, we are basically condemned to live on the verge of subsistence because any increase in our productivity will just be met by an increase in the population and hence our living standards will not rise. But growth kicked in. And since the time of Malthus, the population of the Earth has grown, manyfold. But the economy that has sustained this population has grown by, a factor, an order of magnitude above that, which has allowed, what I would call prosperity. And prosperity is not, I would not characterize it as just trivial stuff. I would consider indoor plumbing and, and certain things as kind of pretty cool and necessary and important for us to as a civilization. And so, I would like to I understand when I think of growth, I think of it in these terms. And I think those terms are still very relevant today. Considering growth as, again, the pursuit of trivial items, of stuff that aren't really significant, I think it requires a very narrow view of what the world is like today. Because let's see, who are the we in this in this kind of like perhaps part of the world that we could characterize as pursuing kind of like less important material goods. My guess is about 1 billion of the world's 7 billion people are there, and might be even overstating it. We have 6 billion people who are way below this threshold. So let's say that we assume that where we're going is like, we don't really need more stuff and we should actually stop it. I'm not sure that actually resolves, that I think that's kind of like small potatoes compared to the challenge that you're putting up on there when you mention the kind of energy efficiencies that we need. But so what do we tell the Bangladeshis? What do we tell the inhabitants of Africa? Should they, do they not get a chance to achieve the kind of prosperity, the indoor plumbing part that we have today? And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
It's would it be okay if I just agreed with you? I mean, I do agree with you. Uh-huh. I agree with you on 2 counts. I agree with you that economic growth delivered us a form of unprecedented prosperity in any meaningful sense of the word over a period of a couple of hundred years. And I particularly agree with you that the poorest in the world deserve indoor plumbing, that they deserve sanitation, they deserve clean water, they deserve a livelihood, they deserve nutrition, that they actually deserve growth. And in fact, I would say in a sense, our challenge is not to remove the growth possibilities in the poorest countries, but to make room for them in a world of finite resources. And so that's the point in which I dispute the triviality of the driving model of the 1 billion of the richest consumers in the world, because it is that model that is still driving the emerging economies, the very poorest economies. And sometimes it's even subverting exactly what you would like them to have, their ability to have the basic necessities of life and to improve the conditions of sanitation and health and nutrition and infant mortality and maternal morbidity and so on and so forth. And when you look at the evidence, and there is some of it in the book, what you find is that this is the place where growth really matters. This is the place where infant mortality falls dramatically for every increase in dollar of income, where maternal morbidity falls, where life satisfaction rises, where life expectancy rises faster and faster. And then after a certain point, those benefits of growth begin to decline in those human terms that you want and I want to define prosperity in. And in fact, You can see in the data, you can see anomalies, so that countries like the US and the UK and Ireland actually have lower life expectancy than countries like Cuba, Costa Rica and Chile. Very, very different social models, very different economic circumstances, a fraction of the income of the richest economies. And so my point, I suppose, is to say that while the model of economic development is being driven by the rich consumers with a burden of material input and environmental impact that is clearly unsustainable for 9 billion people, while that is happening, it is directly removing the possibilities to create prosperity of the kind that we would like in those poorest economies.
Yeah, no, I would certainly agree with that. I would also, I'm interested in, you mentioned there's a point after which, right, these things are no longer matter. And I'd be interested in hearing you talk more about what this point is in two dimensions. Let me put it in a really kind of like touchy-feely one. On what side of that is the iPhone? Now, the iPhone for me is an opportunity to play Candy Crush. But the iPhone in Tijuana is an instrument to keep people on their TB drugs. The iPhone in sub-Saharan Africa has access to micropayments. And there's all sorts of good stuff that flow from this technology. So it seems to me the point that I would make here is that it is highly non-trivial to decide what these thresholds are. And in fact, I struggle to think of what would be the institutional arrangement through which these decisions are made. The other point I'd also like to make is, of course, there are outliers in the curve of life expectancy and infant mortality against economic growth. But there is a pretty decent correlation between, GDP growth, the most, raw measure of economic growth, and good things like infant mortality and life expectancy and so on. And it is true that these things, as we go richer and richer, the gains in these other variables become smaller and smaller, but that's just an artifact of the fact that we can't live forever, and so income is unbounded and life is not, and hence you will get a curve with this shape. And the same thing happens with happiness measurements. The happiness measurements are bounded by the instrument that we use to measure happiness, and income is not bounded. So I don't think that this really necessarily says anything deep about the relationship between income and these other things, but more about how we've chosen to measure it.
Not always. I mean, I accept the point about happiness being a bounded measure and income being unbounded. This is a statistical issue. What is an more obvious issue is issues in relation to things which are real physical health goods, like nutrition and life expectancy and infant mortality. And there the evidence, you don't have to worry about whether it's really a diminishing curve, whether we're looking at statistically comparable things. You just have to look at the positive evidence for the increase in those goods, those real goods, when you allow those countries to develop. So the development of those countries really isn't at stake, and I don't think either of us sort of think it is. But the question of if I can come, you had a couple of questions in there.
Yeah.
The first one I think in some ways is more important. What do I do with my iPhone? Thank you very much. I mean, I suppose one of the thrusts of what I'm trying to do, bringing the work from social psychology and sociology into this, is to understand that it's almost impossible to make those kinds of distinctions, because actually the social fabric is articulated through our relationship with material goods. My relationship to those around me, the children that I love, my family at home, the people I meet, the colleagues that I respect, my peer group as a whole, all of this is articulated through material goods. And increasingly, over the period of the last couple of 100 years, economies and the modern economic view has handed over more of that task to these fundamental material goods. And it's built into them a model in which obsolescence moves not in phases of decades or even in years, but in phases of months, a continual acceleration of that throughput. And this is the point of my rather complicated diagram, is to say that actually this mix of institutional structure, the profit motive of the entrepreneur, and us, just ordinary people, our social logic, our need for connection, our need for the iPhone, actually is what's driving that dynamic. In a way, the third implicit question in your comment, which may be the most important one, is what are the specific things which allow us to decide whether the iPhone is this side or that side, and might they be different in different countries? Of course they might. I cannot see, and would not want to see, a politics of sufficiency that was articulated by rulemaking about individual products. I don't think that's the way that we need to proceed. I think the way that we need to proceed is to be questioning, as I've attempted to do this evening, the underlying institutional structures, and saying, if you got this right, if you reflected the diversity of human prosperity, if you deflected the diversity of human motivations, what kinds of institutions would you build? Would you build these same institutions that drove profit making to the extent that it created ridiculous obsolescence and had us all hooked, not just on Cherry Crash, but on 2048, for those who haven't come across it yet? Do we really need to be building our institutions in those ways, or do we build it in this other way? And what is this other way? This other way is to think about enterprise as service. This other way is to inject self and other into the economic institutions themselves, to look at longevity in terms of fund management, to look at the ridiculous culture of executive remuneration in a banking system which is morally bankrupt, to look at the way in which we can embed initiatives, to embed enterprise into communities, to fund that and to allow governments to fund it. And I think it's always the case that the change from one system to another never arises from someone saying, no, you can't have this, and you can't have that, the iPhone's out and the Samsung Galaxy is in. For whatever reason, I can't imagine now. There is now apparently a conflict mineral-free phone for those who believe that will make a difference. But it isn't about that kind of rulemaking. It's about releasing the potential for institutions to operate in ways which better reflect human motivation.
I think that in your critique of growth, there's several strands. There's issues of equity and ethics, and so there's a strong moral component. And then I would like to separate from that a little bit the constraint component, the kind of like, what are the physical limits, and what do we need to do to address that part of it? And I'm wondering, I'm just going to throw it out there. The IPCC seems to disagree with you. I mean, they put out a report, not 2 weeks ago, in which I don't remember this by heart, so I wrote it down here. Their estimate of what we need to do to keep to the 450 parts per million is much less than zero growth. In fact, they reduce under their, they make all sorts of assumptions, as we all must do for these long-term estimates. They say that we need to cut our consumption by 11% in the year 2100. Off a basis, it's going to be between 3 times and 9 times as big as it is today. So there's a lot of growth in here. And that keeps their temperature at 2 degrees Celsius above. So I mean, are you not perhaps going a little bit beyond?
Well, who am I to argue with several thousand scientists who are actually doing an incredibly important job in highlighting the dangers of climate change, its impacts, its potential mitigation, and the cost of that? I hope they're right. I mean, to be perfectly honest, if that's as easy as it gets, then that's fantastic. What I think my contribution has been is to say it's not. I mean, if you ask, are there technologies? Yes, of course, there are those technologies that could be implemented. If you ask, could we project learning curves that would reduce the costs of those technologies to reduce our investment potential? Yes, of course. And you look historically and you find the costs of photovoltaics, for example, has plummeted by a factor of 10 in the space of a decade and a half. Are there opportunities to design systems more efficiently, to use fewer materials? Yes, of course there are those opportunities. And they are a substantial investment need, however. I mean, the low end of those investments is the order of $1 trillion a year, which is already, approaching 0.5% of global GDP or more. And at that level of encroaching on the structure of the macroeconomy, To be honest, I think it is wishful thinking to say that this will not have an impact on economic growth. And then it's just one thing, that's just climate change. We've said nothing about biodiversity, we've said nothing about arable land, we've said nothing about the condition of soil, we've said nothing about phosphates, a fundamental basis for fertilization of all our food systems. We've said nothing about the minerals that we rely on, not just for iPhones, but for essential medical needs. And all of this has to be managed within an economic system in which the dynamics push relentlessly in the wrong direction. And that's to me is the crucial point, that these underlying dynamics are driving in the wrong direction. It's not, are they possible technology, is it possible in this system? And that's the place where I think we have to think about system innovation.
I'd like to ask one last question and then open it up to hear what you guys might want to say. But I would just posit this as a question. Is not perhaps the more important, the more intractable, difficult problem a political rather than an economic problem? And there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One is, I wonder what the politics of a zero growth world would be when every trade-off is a zero-sum game. Because there is no, right now in a growing world, it is easy to make trade-offs because you just grow a little less and you grow a little more. I think it's an entirely different proposition when these things become zero-sum games. Redistribution becomes more difficult to deal with. And so these sorts of problems. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how politics would deal with such world. And again, this idea that, your talk is about economics, but I wonder whether, a lot of the things that are keeping us from moving in directions that we already know are better than the ones we're on, seem to be political constraints. I live in the United States, and you just look at Washington any day, and there's 50 reasonable policies that could be put in place were it not for the political gridlock that we live in.
I think it's a really important and interesting question, and I don't have a complete answer. I would challenge, I think, the idea that redistribution is easy and
I would agree with that. Yeah, indeed, it's not.
And whether it necessarily becomes harder or difficult, I don't know. It depends on the political circumstance. But the question that you've raised is a question about power. It's a question about political and economic power. It's a question about the effectiveness of democracy, or what we call democracy, to change those conditions, the conditions of power. And it is a deeply, deeply challenging one. I suppose, again, for me, there are two or three hopeful signs in that. One is that some of these changes are already happening. And actually things have changed remarkably since the work that I was doing for the Sustainable Development Commission. There was a point at which the UK government cottoned on to the fact that one of its commissions was about to write a report, just a report about economic growth, to question economic growth. And a senior official from the Treasury turned up at one of those meetings and said, now I understand what you guys have been talking about when you talk about sustainable development. It's about going back to live in caves, isn't it? And the realpolitik of even being able to ask the question of growth was just extraordinarily constrained. And that has changed. And it's changed for some very good reasons. Not the least amongst them is that we don't, even in economics terms, entirely know how we're going to sustain this growth-based economy. Growth rates have been declining in OECD countries systematically over the last couple of decades. There's no guarantee at all that's suddenly going to turn up and give us this utopia.
They're not, we probably.
And in those circumstances, we want this discussion about what if growth isn't there, what if it doesn't come back, not least because of the environmental impacts that it can cause. And so the politics of that, it seems to me, are there already on the table. They are a hard, difficult politics, and they will be played out in all sorts of places. They'll be played out in the Senate and Congress. They'll be played out on the streets. They'll be played out in the Occupy movement. They'll be played out in media columns, in books. And it's an incredibly important politics to bring to bear on changes that will become, I believe, fundamental and necessary.
Yeah. Perhaps there's another strand to the critique of contemporary growth. Starts with the issue of equity that wasn't a big part of your presentation. And if you look at economic growth in the United States, It's not been the same everywhere, but in the United States, it's been a very clear trend that we've generated substantial growth over the last 20 years, and none of it has gone to the median. All of it has, the vast majority of it has accrued to, the top 1%, the top 5%, maybe. It's a very slim sliver of society. And so, we could tolerate much lower growth if it were distributed in a more equitable way. And I have actually an interesting little stat on that. Larry Katz, an economist at Harvard, shared this with me. He said, if the share of income that goes to the top 1% of the top richest 1% of Americans grew from 10% in 1979, so there was 1 out of every $10 went to the top 1% in 1979, to about 22.5%. In 2012. If instead of that accruing to the top 1%, it had been distributed amongst the bottom 90%, the income increase of this bottom 90% would have been about a third compared to nothing. And so, I think there is an equity way into this discussion.
No, absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. It's actually really interesting. It's kind of almost worse than you're describing in a way. What we have had, many Western countries have had, is growth without prosperity. And it's been growth for the top and prosperity in terms of ordinary social well-being declining in many other places, static or declining in many other places. And when you look at the statistics in relation not to income but to wealth, you find an even more staggering story, that the wealth of the lowest decile is actually negative, and the wealth of the highest decile is huge by comparison even with the income disparities that you're looking at. So this is a huge story, and I wanted really, when you mentioned inequality to me before, you were suggesting how difficult some things would be when you didn't have growth. And I think this is a really interesting question. Benjamin Friedman, in a book a few years ago I think it was called The Moral Consequences of Growth, or something like that, made a similar argument, in the sense that what he said was, if you didn't have growth, you lost civility. And actually, he blamed the loss of civility really for the stagnating incomes of middle classes, and argued that actually civilization itself was falling apart and was dependent on growth. Now, I think this is an argument that you have to take seriously. It is important in a society to have a sense of a kind of social glue. It's important in society to have a sense of progress. It's important. Prosperity itself is important. The fact that the word hope lives in the word prosperity is important, because actually, if you lose that hope, if you lose that sense of progress, if you lose things getting better in society, then you really do begin. The evidence seems to be that things do fragment. They fragmented after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia. Life expectancy fell by a decade in the space of only a few years, particularly amongst men in Russia. When things fall apart, bad things happen. And so you have to, the agenda has to not be, let's stop growth, when can we decide which things we're allowed in growth? It has to be to create the conditions of flourishing, to create the conditions of prosperity, and to talk about progress in terms of things getting better rather than bigger or faster or more in terms of throughput. And that's a debate in which it is possible to redistribute. It is possible to think about more egalitarian distributions. It's essential that you invest to achieve it. It's essential that government is able to play a role. It's essential, as we've discussed, that we have a politics for it. But it's a world not of deprivation and paucity, but of opportunity and hope. And I think that's the dialogue that we should be going for. And if I had the chance to retitle my book, I'm not sure that I would use without growth, because it is at the end a sort of an apparently, at least, a way of, and people perceive it as a way of restricting opportunity. But it was a very specific discussion about the relationship between prosperity and flourishing, and the concept of economic growth as an increase in the material throughput of the gross domestic product. And that, I think, is an equation, a conversation that we've actually, fortunately, rightly, I think, moved a little bit beyond. now. And the next conversations will be about equity. They will be about opportunity. They will be about the ability of ordinary people to flourish.
Yeah. Well, on this hopeful note, thank you, Tim. This was great. Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks.